Speak again the ancient oaths. Life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination. Hello and welcome to Speak the Words, a Stormlight Archive podcast. I'm Shawn.
And I'm Mango.
And this is a podcast where I normally take about 40 minutes to walk through the plot of the Stormlight Archives. Obviously, we're on the first book, Way of Kings. Last time we finished part 1 of the book, and so this time we're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm not going to use the timer. I'm just going to go through the 3 interlude chapters. They're shorter, so this will probably be a shorter episode than normal. So no timer, just going to do the 3 interlude chapters, and next week we'll start with part 2. But before we actually get into the interludes, Mango.
Yes.
How did part 1 end? What happened last time?
Well, for Shawn, she had this scheme for how to learn a bunch of stuff about philosophy and like cram really quickly to try and get accepted as a ward. And she succeeded. And then Kaladin almost commit suicide. And then his Spren friend, Sylphrena, came back just in time and convinced him to not die. And so he started being a badass again and took control of the unit he was part of and learned everyone's names and swore to protect them. So
Yes.
yay for not killing yourself.
Yeah, that is a big plus. The only thing I will add to what you said is that just because it's going to be important later, Shalon did meet an ardent named Capsule, who was, they were being a little flirty with each other, which you shouldn't be because he's a priest, so he should not be being flirty with her. But he was, so
I didn't realize he was a priest.
Yeah, the Ardents are priests.
Oh, okay.
So that technically he should not have been, flirty with her, but he was.
Yeah, he was. Maybe he's not the best priest, or maybe he's a fraud.
Oh, well, we'll have to find out. In a long time because she's not in the next part.
Yeah, a long time.
I will bring. I do want to, because we finished part 1, I do want to talk a little bit more about if you had any thoughts now that we've gotten through all of part 1 about the epigraphs of part 1, because I will tell you that they change in part 2. They no longer is part 1 was all these quotes of people before they die.
It's no longer like that.
In part 2, it's going to be different. The epigraphs are going to be. Oh, I'm so excited. The part 2 epigraphs are going to mean nothing to you, but man, they're good.
They mean everything to you.
They mean everything to me. I will pick out really quickly. I think the last 2 epigraphs in part 1, or actually, I'm gonna pick out a couple really quickly that I want to bring back because they are interesting. One of them was 10 orders. We were loved once. Why have you forsaken us, Almighty? Shard of my soul, where have you gone? Which is interesting and relates to something else that you were kind of introduced to in the part. But I won't push you too far on that. The other one I want you to keep in mind, or one of the other ones I want you to keep in mind, is I have seen the end and have heard it named the Night of Sorrows, the True Desolation, the Everstorm. So just store that somewhere in deep storage in the back. Hopefully one day I'll be able to go, hey, remember, I can go back and read this again, and you'll go, oh, I do kind of remember that. And then I think the only other one of real importance is the final one, which is 3 of 16 ruled, but now the broken one reigns. And in like 6 years, we'll come back to those. This week, though, like I said, we're doing the interludes. In the book, when you flip the page off of the end of part 1, it just says interludes, and it says Ishik, Non-Balat, and Zeth. So interlude 1 starts. It is Ishik's interlude, and I'm just going to tell you it has the same chapter symbol as the one for the prelude. That's kind of the chapter symbol they just use for any POV that isn't big enough to get its own symbol. So in Ishik, we start in the Pure Lakes, which is a place in Roshar on the map. But we start in the Pure Lakes. A man named Ishik is going to meet with a group of strange foreigners. He wears a pair of lake sandals on his submerged feet and knee-length pants, and he doesn't wear a shirt. He refers to himself as a Pure Laker, and he refers to some deity named New Relique, which is a new one. We've heard Almighty a lot, but we haven't heard New Relique yet. Ishik whistled despite having a bad day. He'd only caught 5 fish. The tides had been irregular. Bad days were coming. The Pure Lake extends in all directions, hundreds of miles wide, the water perfectly transparent. At its deepest, it was never more than 6 feet. In most places, the warm, slow-moving water came up only to about mid-calf, and it was filled with tiny fish, colorful cremlings, and eel-like river spren. So it's just this massive body of water that, for the most part, is only, like you said, only comes up to, like, mid-calf. And it's warm, and it's slow moving. It's like this massive paradise. I think the Pure Lakes are very cool. The Pure Lake had once been claimed by a king. The area had been named Sela Tales and had been one of the Epoch Kingdoms. Ishik was a Pure Laker first before any nation. Ishik. He approached the village of Fu Abra, a cluster of buildings perched on blocks beneath the water. They were the only things for miles that broke the surface of the Pure Lake. Other people moved around here slowly. There was no reason to run in the Pure Lakes. Ishik thought only foreigners were so hasty. He nodded to Thaspik, a dark-skinned man who passed him, pulling a small raft. Thaspik asked him how his fishing had been, and Ishik said it had been terrible. He says Vun Makak has blighted him. He asks how Thaspik is, and the man says that he lost a shirt while washing, as if that is some sort of, like, omen. Ishik asks if his foreigners were here, and Thaspik tells him that they were over at Mabe's place. Vun Makak said that they don't eat her out of home, Ishik said, continuing on his way, or infect her with their constant worries. Sun and tide send it, Thaspik said with a chuckle, continuing on. Mabe's house was at the center of the village. Ishik didn't understand why she wanted to sleep in a building. He slept on his raft most nights. It never got cold in the Pure Lake except during high storms, and they didn't seem to be much of a worry to him. The Pure Lake drained into pits and holes when the storms came, so you just shoved your raft into a crevice and used it to break the storm. The storms didn't fling boulders and blow down buildings here like in the east. Ishik wondered why everyone didn't just come to the Pure Lake, then thought he was happy they didn't. If everyone came here, there wouldn't be a place to walk without stumbling over some foreigner. He stepped into Mabe's house. The floor was low enough that a few inches of water still covered it. Pure Lakers liked it that way. Mabe nodded at Ishik. She'd been chasing Ishik for years, and one day Ishik might let her catch him. Ishik's foreigners were in the corner, at a table a little higher off the ground and with footrests to keep their feet out of the water. Ishik thought they were fools, sitting inside, wearing shirts, and keeping their feet out of the water. Mabe asked him how his fishing was, and he told her it had been terrible. She tells him that his soup is free today to make up for his bad luck. He thanked her and took the soup. Now he owed her. Enough bowls and he'd be forced to wed her. He'd caught her a special fish today, though, and that made up for his debt to her. Mabe asked him how she was ever supposed to catch him, and Ishik says that it's hard to catch a fisherman. He took his soup and walked over to the foreigners. There were 3 of them. 2 were dark-skinned Makabaki, though they were the strangest Makabaki he'd ever seen. One was thick-limbed, where most of his kind were small and fine-boned, and he had a completely bald head. The The other was taller, with short dark hair, lean muscles, and broad shoulders. Ishik called them Grump and Blunt. The third man had light tan skin, like an Alethi. He didn't seem quite right either, though. The eyes were the wrong shape, and his accent was certainly not Alethi. He spoke the Sealay language worse than the other two, and usually stayed quiet. So, remember how I said that everybody on Roshar has the epicanthic folds except for the Shin?
Mm-hmm.
So, this third guy, which Ishik calls him Thinker, he looks Alethi, but he has Shin eyes. Ishik wondered how Thinker had gotten a scar across his scalp. Life outside the Pure Lakes was very dangerous. You are late, traveler, said Blunt. He had the build and air of a soldier, though none of the three carried weapons. Ishik said that it was the right day. And he's like, yeah, no, I'm here. It's Saturday. I was supposed to be here Saturday. The day is right, friend, Grump said, but we were to meet at noon, understand? Ishik said they were close enough, and Grump shook his head as Mabe brought them some soup. She left Ishik a cup of wine, trying to balance out the debt from the fish he'd brought her. Grump asks Ishik for his report. I've been to Fu Release, Fu Namir, Fu Albast, and Fu Morin this month, Ishik said. Nobody has seen this man you search for. Blunt asked Ishik if he'd asked the right questions. Ishik says he's been doing this for ages, and Blunt says it's been 5 months with no results. Ishik asks if they wanted him to make up stories. No stories, friend, Grump said. We want only the truth. Well, I've given it to you. You swear it by New Relique, that god of yours? Ishik tells Grump not to say that name, and Grump frowned. But he is your god, understand? Is his name holy, not to be spoken? And Ishik thinks to himself, he explains their holy system. He says that New Relique was their god, but they pretended he wasn't. Vun Makak was his younger, spiteful brother, and he had to be tricked into thinking you worshipped him, otherwise he'd get jealous. It was only safe to speak of these things in a holy grotto. Ishik tells them that he swears by Vun Makak, may he watch over me and curse me as he pleases. I have looked diligently. No foreigner like this one you mentioned, with his white hair, clever tongue, and arrow-like face, has been seen. Grump says the man dyes his hair sometimes and wears disguises. Ishik says he's asked using the names they'd given him, but nobody has seen him. He offers to find them a fish to help them find the man they search for. Blunt said that there might actually be something to the fish Ishik talked about. Superstition, Grump replied. You always look for superstition, Val. Val wasn't the man's name. Ishik was sure they used fake names. That's why he used his own names for them. If they were going to give him fake names, he'd give them fake names back. Blunt snapped back at Grump, calling him by the name Timu. But before the two could argue more, Thinker interrupted them. The three foreigners switched to another language and continued their argument. Ishik tried to listen in and determine what language it was, but he wasn't very good with languages. He had searched for their man. He didn't bother wondering why they were looking for this Hoid, whoever he was. Ishik sat back as the foreigners finished their argument, paid him, then stepped down into the water. Like most foreigners, they wore boots up to their knees and they splashed out of the home. As Ishik leaves, he waves at Mabe and thinks maybe he should let her catch him. He was getting old. Might be nice to relax. His foreigners splashed down into the Pure Lake. Grump was last. He seemed very dissatisfied. Where are you, roamer? What a fool's quest this is. Then he added in his own tongue, Alavanta Kamalu Kayana. He splashed after his companions. Well, you've got the full part right, Ishik said with a chuckle, turning his own direction and heading off to check on his own traps. And that is the Ishik interlude. I love the Pure Lakes. I'm going to stop for a second and just kind of talk about the Pure Lakes. I love the culture of I love what Sanderson does so awesomely with the interludes is he can jump to a random part of Roshar and just be like, here's an entirely different culture. And I love everything about the Pure Lakes. I love the idea of their religion is they worship a god, but they pretend to worship another god so as not to piss off the other god. That is just, I think that's really fun. And these fun foreigners that do not match the description of anybody that lives on Roshar. Any of the different kinds of people, and they have weird accents. And they're searching for a man named Hoid. Have I told you about Hoid?
I wouldn't remember if you had.
Well, I'm going to tell you about Hoid now, because you can know this. this would not make any sense to you reading through this book. You could finish this book and this book would make no sense to you, or this would make no sense to you unless you looked up online what Sanderson has said about this interlude. Hoid, the best way I can describe Hoid is he is Brandon Sanderson's Nick Fury in the MCU. Hoid is a character that appears in all of his books. Hoid always shows up. Sometimes he goes by a different name. Sometimes he looks different. Sometimes he's just called Hoid. But these people are here, and I will just tell you, because again, you wouldn't know this unless you found out from Sanderson. These people are not from Roshar. These people are from other worlds. These people are specifically, and I'm not going to get too detailed here because that I could get into spoiler territory, but these people are specifically other characters from other books. I read this the first time and thought absolutely nothing of it except for picking up on Hoid being mentioned. And then I went online and reading through it again, now that I've read all of his books, I was like, oh yeah, it's really obvious who these people are. You would not be able to pick up on any of that unless you have read every single one of his books. But that is this chapter's purpose, is to introduce the concept of Hoid, and also that there are other people on Roshar. There are other people that have interests in the things going on this planet.
Interworld shenanigans.
Interworld shenanigans, yes, and I love it. But that is the weirdest of the interludes. The next two interludes are fairly straightforward. Interlude 2 is titled Non-Balat, and I don't know if you remember, but Shalon did mention that Non-Balat is her older brother. So the chapter starts, and it starts with Non-Balat liked killing things. Not people, but animals. He sat on the porch of his mansion. Yeah, he sat on the porch of his mansion, pulling the legs off a crab. He didn't like to talk about his habit. He's not great. He didn't like to talk about his habit, not even to Aelita. The Devar mansion was covered in vines. They'd received word that morning that Shalon had become Yasna's ward. Non-Balat walked with a cane, 23 years old and already a cripple. His leg had been broken bad. They'd almost taken off the leg. His axe-hound, Scrack, was playing in the yard. Non-Balat had bred axe-hounds since his youth. Scrack was tearing the legs off a creature she'd caught. Axe-hounds had 6 legs and no shell or skin. Their body was covered with some fusion of the two. So axe-hounds are like this world's version of dogs.
But they look gross.
They're, I don't know. I actually can't really think of what they look like. They don't have fur. They're it's like a combination of shell and skin that covers them.
So they look gross.
Fair enough, I guess. They're crab dogs.
Yeah.
Balat asks the axe-hound, holy shit. Okay, let's try that again. Balat asks the axe-hound if he's a coward. He grabbed another crab and started pulling off its legs. I couldn't have gone to chase Yasna. Only a woman could get close enough to her to steal the Soulcaster. We decided that. Besides, someone needs to stay back and care for the needs of the house, Balat said. He felt like a coward. This plan probably won't even work, he said. They were a broken family. Years of suffering, their father's brutal temper had driven Asha Jushu to vice and Tet Wickham to despair. Only Balat and Shalon escaped unscathed. I don't know about that one, buddy. I don't think you're unscathed, and I don't think Shalon's unscathed either. Shalon had never been touched. At some times, Balat hated her for that. He wished Helleran had survived. He'd been known as non-Helleran since he was the oldest. He'd stood up to their father. He was dead, so was their father, and they'd left behind a family of cripples. So, this is a really interesting part of society at Nyakaved. The non in non-Balat is like more of like an honorific or whatever. Like, non just means eldest. So, when their older brother Helleran had been alive, he had been known as non-Helleran. And then I think Balat would have been Asha Balat. I think Asha is the second oldest, and Tet is the third oldest. I think that's how it works. But His actual name is Balat Devar, but he's known as Non-Balat. And so everybody in their family's really messed up. He likes to pull the legs off crabs. Jushu has an addiction, and Weekum is depressed. He has depression.
And Shalon is apparently also a cripple?
Non-Balat says that she's not, that she's the only one that escaped unscathed, but I would refer back to part 1, and there's the chapter where Yasna yells at Shalon and tells her to get lost. Shalon runs away, finds a corner, and starts to cry because it reminds her of how her father used to yell. So she didn't suffer physical abuse, but it definitely seems that she suffered emotional abuse. And also, I will remind that at certain points she talks about things that she's very clearly repressing memories. She talks about it a lot, that she's repressing memories. There's things that she doesn't want to think about. So while she wasn't physically abused, there was definitely something happening there.
So when her brother Balat says a family of cripples, he doesn't just mean like physical cripples.
Yeah, no, because Jushu is addicted, has an addiction, and Weekum has depression. Like, I mean, yeah, I think Balat is the only one that's literally has like problems walking. I think the rest of it is just like mental health issues.
Okay. Carry on.
Balat, a voice cried. Weekum appeared on the porch. The younger man was past his recent bout of melancholy, it appeared. What? Balat said, standing. Weekum rushed down the stairs, hurrying up to him. Vines, then grass, pulling back before him. We have a problem. How large a problem? Pretty big, I'd say. Come on. And then the chapter ends there.
So he pulls the legs off of a crab, reminisces about how shitty his dad was, and then stuff happens.
Something happened. Something happened. I hope you like waiting to find out what happened.
Cool.
Interlude 3 is titled The Glory of Ignorance, and it has Zeth's symbol.
Oh, hey, Zeth.
Zeth, Sun Villano, truthless of Shinovar, sat on a tavern floor. I think this continues into the other books, but I can't remember. I'm pretty sure every Zeth chapter starts with Zeth, Sun Villano, truthless of Shinovar, blah, 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 blah. And I love it. He hadn't summoned his shard blade in years. It felt equally long since he'd had a bath. He didn't care. People didn't ask him to assassinate people if they thought he was a wretch. So it's been almost 6 years since he killed Gavilar in the prologue, and since then he has not drawn his sword once.
Huh.
So he'll do whatever you say, asked one of the mine workers sitting at the table. There were 4 men there. Zeth's current master, Took, responded. Yeah, he sure will. Hey, Kerp, look at me. Kerp means child in the local dialect. Most Easterners claimed that the Shin looked like children. Zeth looked at Took. Stand up, Took said. Zeth did so. Jump up and down. Zeth complied. Pour Ton's beer on your head. Zeth reached for it, but Ton pulled the cup away, saying he wasn't done yet. He tells Took to make Zeth do something else. Took pulled out his knife and tossed it to Zeth. He told Zeth to cut his arm up. A man named Amark said that wasn't right. Zeth complied and cut at his arm with the knife. Cut your throat. Oh, fuck, my throat. Speaking of throats, cut your throat, Took said. Amark started to interject, but Zeth spoke. I am forbidden to take my own life. As truthless, it is the nature of my suffering to be forbidden the taste of death by my own hand. Amark settled down. Dust Mother, Ton said. He always talks like that? Took asks what he meant, and Ton says Zeth talks like a Light Eyes. Yeah, Took said. He's like a slave, only better, 'cause he's Shin. He don't talk back he don't run or talk back or anything. Don't have to pay him neither. He's like a parchment, but smarter. Worth right many spheres, I'd say. He eyed the other men. Could take him to the mines with you to work and collect his pay. He'd do things you don't wanna. Muck out the privy, whitewash the home, all kinds of useful stuff. One of the other men asked how Took had gotten Zeth. Took was a worker who moved from town to town. He made quick friends by showing off Zeth. Took launched into a completely fabricated tale of how he acquired Szeth. In reality, Szeth's previous master had sold Szeth for a bag of seeds to Took. There had been dozens before them. At first, his owners enjoyed having them. Some treated him well, some didn't, but they always got rid of him. He thought they must have sensed something. They must have sensed somewhere deep down that he was capable of so much more than they used him for. Szeth tried to play the part, tried to make himself act less refined. It was very difficult for him, perhaps impossible. What would these men say if they knew that the man who emptied their chamber pot was a shard bearer and a surge binder, a windrunner like the radiance of old? The moment he summoned his blade, his eyes would turn from dark green to pale, almost glowing, sapphire, a unique effect of his particular weapon. So, I'll stop there for a second and talk about a little bit of what he just said. Szeth says that he's a shard bearer, which obviously we know because he has the shard blade. And he's also a surge binder, which I think this is the first time we've heard that phrase. He also mentions that he's a windrunner, like the Radiants of old. Do you remember the Radiants? They were brought up in the Kaladin flashback
the ones
chapter.
that betrayed the ones that betrayed humanity?
Yes, the ones that Liren says betrayed humanity.
Cool.
And Szeth says that he is one of them, that he is a windrunner. And he also says that his blade turns his eyes from dark to light when he summons it, which is interesting. I don't know if they've talked about that yet in the rest of the books. So
he's not a light eyes, but he's a light eyes.
Yes, when he summons his blade, he's a light eyes. Which, we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this in the future. They'll talk about some other stuff later. But I just wanted to call attention to him saying that he's a windrunner, that like the Radiants of old, and that he's a surge binder.
But we don't know what surge binder means.
No, we do not.
Well, you do, but I don't.
Yeah, I know what it means. I think you could take a guess if you thought about the things that Szeth could do that others can't. He says he's a shard bearer, and we've seen other shard bearers before. People that have shards, right? So, surge binding is something that we haven't seen any other character do, so it would relate to something that only Szeth can do. Szeth would rather do mundane tasks than be forced to kill, though. The day he killed Gavilar haunted him. He'd never been given instructions like those before. The instructions had been, kill, destroy, and cut your way to the king. Be seen doing it, leave witnesses, wounded but alive. Took finished his story, and the men turned to Szeth. He confirmed that the entire tale had been true. Took said that he had to get to bed, as they had to hit the road in the morning. Szeth wondered if the Parshendi had known what they were doing when they tossed away Szeth's Oathstone as they fled Kholinar that night. He'd been forced to recover it and wait by the side of the road until a passing merchant had cared enough to inquire. Szeth had been in just a loincloth as he'd removed his white clothing to avoid detection. He had to preserve himself so he could suffer. So, not only can he can't take his own life to get out of the punishment, but he also can't half-ass it. Like, he has to try his hardest in every scenario. You know, he can't just welcome death. The merchant had taken Szeth with him to Yakaved. The man had been worried that with Gavilar being murdered, a foreigner like Szeth might have been treated poorly by the Alethi. The Alethi had never searched for him. He thought they must have expected him to flee with the Parshendi. They probably expected to find him on the Shattered Plains. The other men left for the night, ignoring Took, who was trying to get another beer in exchange for a story of how he'd met the Night Watcher and stolen a sphere that glowed black. The tale reminded Szeth of the sphere he'd been given by Gavilar. He'd hidden it in Yakaved. He didn't want any of his masters to find it. So yeah, one of the last things Gavilar had done before he died was give Szeth a sphere that glowed black in the darkness. And Szeth had hidden it before, starting his long route to where he is today 6 years later. And this other guy says that he's apparently stolen a sphere that's similar. Took left the bar with Szeth in tow. Szeth wished that the second sister, known as Nomen to the Easterners, had risen to give more light. Took stumbled and fell over in the street. Zeth thought he was drunk and prepared to carry him home. Then he noticed a knife in Took's neck. The attackers came out of an alleyway and were about to attack Zeth, but stopped. He was a Shin and not a threat to them. They considered selling him. They told Zeth to come to them, and he obeyed. They found barely any spheres on Took's corpse. One of the men asked about Zeth's Oathstone that had been on Took's corpse, and one of the men said that it was worthless, but Zeth spoke up. I am required to tell you, Zeth said quietly, that you are holding my Oathstone. So long as you possess it, you are my master. What's that? One of the men asked. The first one closed his hand around the stone, shooting a wary look at the others. He glanced back at Zeth. Your master? What does that mean exactly, in precise terms and all? I must obey you, Zeth said. In all things, though, I will not follow in order to kill myself. He also couldn't be ordered to give up his blade, but there was no need to mention that at the moment. You'll obey me? The man said. You mean, you'll do what I say? Yes. Anything I say? Zeth closed his eyes. Yes. Well, ain't that something interesting, the man said, musing. Something interesting indeed. And that's where Interlude 3 ends. And those are the 3 interludes. We caught up with Zeth.
Cool. He's a slave.
He's a slave. And we got a little bit more. I don't think they mentioned the Oathstone before this, but we got a little more explanation of how exactly his slavery works. Whoever is holding the Oathstone, he must obey. But yeah, I already brought up the
murdered that guy 6 years ago. Like, was that also someone telling him to do that?
Yes, the orders he'd been given, they say, are, it said, kill, destroy, and cut your way to the king, be seen doing it, leave witnesses, wounded but alive. And then he said that when the Parshendi ran, after Gavilar had been killed, they had thrown away Zeth's Oathstone. And Zeth had just stood on the side of the road, holding it, until somebody actually, came up and approached him.
So he's not allowed to just not belong to someone?
No, he has to, let himself be taken. He can't do anything to avoid it.
Okay, but, if he has his own Oathstone, he can't just go about life? That sucks.
No, he can't. Yeah, it does suck.
Who made those rules? Besides Brandon Sanderson.
I would presume that it is something with his culture of the Shin.
I don't know if I think that's a good thing.
Because what do you think about what he calls himself? Truthless of Shinovar. What do you think of Truthless?
I have no idea.
You have no idea? What? Okay. They'll explain it at some point, but it is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's very straightforward. I won't go into it just yet, though.
He never tells the truth?
Something along those lines. It has to do with him telling the truth. And I will bring up, just because I genuinely do not remember if they ever bring this up. I assume they have to, but I don't know when it happens, and it's such a minor thing that I'm just gonna bring it up now. He calls himself Zeth's son Villano. We've seen earlier that one of the books that Yasna wanted Shallan to read was written by somebody, daughter somebody. And that's another Shin name. So, Zeth is so ashamed of himself that he does not refer to himself as the son of his father, like most of his people would do. He instead refers to him as the son of his grandfather.
Huh.
So instead of Zeth's son something, it's Zeth's son Villano.
Huh.
Which I think is an interesting touch.
Yeah. Can I just say, fuck being known by your parents? You are your own person? I don't like that.
The Shin culture is fascinating. And to be honest, I still don't know a whole lot about it. He hasn't really dived too deep into Shinovar yet, but presumably he will at some point. There's still 6 more books. So yeah. Anything else I want to grab out of this? I'll just say terms again because they might come back later. Dust Mother is like a curse, the cursing by the Dust Mother. And Took says that he met something called the Night Watcher. But yeah, besides that is the interludes. I'll really quickly just say the next page says Part 2, The Illuminating Storms, and underneath it is written Dalinar, Kaladin, and Adolin.
New people.
So those are our 3 viewpoints for Part 2. Do you, at this point, remember Dalinar? I would not be surprised if you didn't. He has been mentioned once.
Do not.
So Dalinar was mentioned at the very beginning in the prologue. Zeth walked by him at the feast that he was at.
Oh, he was the princess's brother, someone there.
So Elokar is the princess's brother. Dalinar was the king's brother, and Dalinar was the one that was drunk.
Oh.
Dalinar was the one that was just sitting there drunk off his mind, and the people were trying to get him up.
Nice.
And so he's one of our viewpoint characters for the next part.
Nice.
Yeah, that's all I've got for this week. Yeah, definitely ended up being a shorter episode. I'm glad we did it this way, because oh my god, you're gonna learn a lot about Dalinar in the next chapter. It's many pages.
Great. Makes sense. I sound so unenthusiastic, but I do enjoy this.
I can tell that you're interested in what's going on.
I'm just like entirely confused by like everything, so I don't know how to show enthusiasm. But
yeah, it's confusing. I'm trying my best to call back to stuff and like try and but it's also a lot of setup right now. Like, we are still setting up, like I said, I mean, Shallan's not even the next part. We're introducing new characters. Like, it's a lot.
Yeah, it feels like stuff hasn't really happened yet.
And to be honest, like, that's the thing about this book, is that I will say the ending of this book is incredible, but it is book 1 of a planned 10-book series, you know?
Yeah.
So it is a lot of setup. But I think that there's a lot of really good stuff in there that I'm excited to get to. And I think we're going to start getting to it in this next part. But yeah. For now, Mango, where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitch at Mango Asteroid. That's about it. Where can people find you, Shawn?
On Twitter at Shawn_AFK. You guys can also follow this show on Twitter at SpeakStormlight. You guys can also find us on Anchor at anchor.fm/speakthewords, which is the that's where we host the podcast. Sorry, I totally blanked. And you guys can also find the podcast on, you guys can also find it on Breaker, Google Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, Spotify, those places. But, yeah, I think that's everything. Next week, we'll start part 2. We'll meet Dalinar and Adolin, and, we will find out about the visions that Dalinar has.
All right.
Bye.